about to start the program. If everyone can just please be seated, we're about to start. Thank you. Thank you. Before we start tonight, I just wanted to share a quick prayer that I actually shared with the administrative team last week that really sort of struck a nerve with me. So please indulge. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Spirit. Amen. O Eternal Trinity, my sweet love, you, light, give us wisdom. You, supreme strength, strengthen us. Today, eternal God, let our cloud be dissipated so that we may perfectly know and follow your truth in truth with a free and simple heart. Amen. That comes to us from St. Catherine of Siena. We just want to thank everyone for coming this evening and taking time out of your busy schedule to attend this very special event. Before we begin, I just want to acknowledge the work of our parent networking committee, who was so instrumental in the planning of our Friday morning coffee series this year, in addition to bringing Dr. Helen Immordino-Yang here this evening. As a committee, our work has been geared towards improving parent dialogue regarding the raising of our children, as well as raising awareness regarding our role as adults in modeling good learning, best practice, and a supportive environment from which our children will flourish. We especially wanted to acknowledge the work of our Dean of Faculty, Laura Jane Lake, for her work in bringing Mary Helen to us this evening. Thank you, Laura. As well as to the entire administrative team, teachers and staff who set the tone for establishing a really great day today. On behalf of a grateful community, I wish to extend my sincere thanks to all of them. Thank you. So this morning I arrived bright and early, coming in, and I had the good fortune of meeting Mary Helen as she began her day. After arriving in from the West Coast late last night, it was clear that she was bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and ready to begin her Rosarian experience. She offered my two sons, Thomas and Daniel, a very warm introduction, which I really appreciated. Following our introduction, we went on our separate ways, and my 6-year-old Thomas went on to ask me who she was and what she was doing at the school today, what she was going to be doing. I explained that Mary Helen was a renowned neuroscientist, someone who was here to talk about how we learn and how our brains work within the learning process. Thomas responded that I was really making too big of a deal of the whole thing. Because all we really had to do to make learning happen was just tell kids to just pay attention. But sure enough, though, after observing Tom's and some of the other classes today, I realized that he and his classmates were receiving a very special gift. We saw Mary Helen work closely with the children, describing what attributes make our brain and our learning specifically human. She spoke about how emotions, how reflecting, and how caring for others stimulate brain functioning, and how they can become more active in their thinking through their actions and becoming more self-aware. With the middle school, she spoke about the broader impacts of culture and their role in contributing to a healthy learning environment for all. As mentioned, and some of you may know this, Dr. Immordino-Yang comes to us from California, as I discussed. She serves as an associate professor of education in the Rosarian School of Education and associate professor of psychology at the Brain and Creativity Institute. She's also a member of the neuroscience graduate program faculty at the University of Southern California. A former public junior high school science teacher, she earned her doctorate at Harvard University in 2005, before going on to receive numerous local, national, and international awards for her research and impact on education. She is a member of the governing board of the International Mind, Brain, and Education Society, and recently authored our featured book, which is available for purchase in the lobby, Emotional Learning and the Brain. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mary Helen Immordino-Yang.
Thank you everyone for having me. And this is what I love most about my work, honestly, is to get outside of my lab sometimes. I mean, I love my lab too. This is a pretty hot mic, so I don't know if anybody wants to turn it down a little. That's okay. I'll try to not clear my throat and talk quietly. But to get outside of my lab and talk with teachers and parents about what we're learning and also about what their ideas are about what it means. Because to me, the most important reason I do this work, which is hard work sometimes, is to help you. It's to help myself, I'm a parent too, right? And it's to help the world be a better place for our kids and for ourselves. And we need to understand the world in new ways now. When we look around at the politics, at the global politics, at the ways that people are moving, at the situations that we're facing, not just in our own country or in our own state, but at the level of the world and as the level of a species, we're in a tenuous balance right now, I think. We're in a place where we can and we must turn around the way we think about what it means to be a human being and really take responsibility for our actions in a new way. Because we have the power now to do things, to destroy other people or to help other people like we never have been able to before. Our actions now have much broader impact at the level of the world, of the planet, of the species than they ever could have before. And we see the tragic consequences of this in many, many levels around the world right now. And I think that the hope and the dream is that we fix this from the bottom up, and we fix this through education. Education to me is one of the most important and pressing problems and difficult, complicated problems that I think we face right now as a species, because if you think about it, it is such a hard question. What we're actually asking ourselves is, what do we do with our young people? What do we expose our young people to under our watch, under our guidance? What do we want them to know how to be able to do? What do we want them to understand? How do we want them to develop habits for thinking and feeling about themselves and about each other, so that then they can go out and take custody of our world when they become adults? Because if you think about it, every single problem that faces us at every level is in some way solvable, dependent on our education system. Treating cancer, solving the world's wars, understanding the climate, predicting weather. All of the problems that face us as a species rely on our ability to think well and to interact with one another and to use our thoughts and our interactions to actually build better knowledge into the future. And to me, that screams for innovating in the way we raise and teach our children, because we need them to learn skills that we can't even imagine they're going to need yet. Right? We don't know what the world's going to look like by the time our kindergartners now are 30-year-old people. What kind of technology is going to be available? What kind of politics are going to be going on? What kinds of situations around the globe? What kinds of immigration? What kinds of movement? We need to raise kids now who can think complexly on their feet, who can work together with other people, who can be creative and innovative, and who have the drive and the passion and the skills to actually make what they believe in happen. And to do that, we really need to rethink what I think it means to learn and to be an educated person. And that's what I've been working on through my work. And I'm going to start the talk. First of all, I just want to say two things. The first thing is I donated the books, so please, if you're buying them to support Rosarian Academy, not me personally, and I just have to say that because I don't like selling things to people. And the other, sorry, no, I'm just not a salesperson. I'd be a terrible, terrible business person. And the second thing is that I would really like you to feel comfortable interrupting me over the course of the evening as we're talking. It's a little hard for me to see you because I've got a light in my face. But please raise your hands and ask me, and you know, and if I say things that aren't clear or you want to know. That said, if I kind of ask you to wait a minute, if I'm afraid I'm going to lose my train of thought, don't be offended. Remind me that you had a question, okay? Because I mean, this looks like a talking head, like talking at you, but that would be somewhat hypocritical given what I'm about to tell you about education, okay? So what I would like you to really feel like is that this is a big conversation, and I'm just here to tell you what I think and what we've been learning, and then you're here to help me think about it in new ways and to think about what it might mean for you too and your kids. So that said, I want to start by just kind of unpacking the title. Embodied brains, social minds. Oh, I took the social minds out to make it easier, but just emotional minds, right? Because our emotions are social, right? We feel, the things we feel are almost always to do with other people and ourselves and our future, right? Those are the things we care about. It's pretty rare that your emotion is, ow, I stubbed my toe. Okay, that's one, right? But that doesn't really last. The stuff that matters to us, the emotions we feel, are almost always about how other people see us, or what we believe in, or what's right or just or good, or who we are, or who we want to be in the future, or the people we love, right, and care about. Our lives are inherently social, and what we're learning biologically is that the very legacy of our intelligent brain at this late stage in our evolution is actually our social interdependence. It's the fact that we no longer, as one person, as an individual, can live our life. We can't even as a family live a life. We now have these hugely interdependent units of people and systems. You know, I don't know about you, but I didn't sew my own clothes. You know what I mean? And if I get sick, I gotta go get a doctor who's specialized in that to help me. And if you have a child with a problem, maybe you come ask me for some advice, or maybe you go ask your mom and get some, grandmotherly advice, right? We work in groups of people and systems of people. And we need to start to understand that real intelligence, real skills in an educated person reflect that. They reflect that biological reality, that we're not individuals working in isolation. That doesn't mean that we don't have to think for ourselves. And it doesn't mean that we're always in groups when we're working, right? But what it means is that our thoughts and our actions and our decisions and our knowledge are infused with cultural ways of knowing, with values and with norms and with historical thinking that pervades the way in which we interpret problems and even label problems in the first place, and the way in which we aim to solve them in the future. What counts as a solution, what counts as a problem, is hugely cultural. The things we teach our children in school are also hugely cultural. There's absolutely no necessary inherent reason why, for example, learning to read is the best thing to do, right? Except that in our culture, it absolutely is. You can't get by in our culture being illiterate because our main currency of exchange of information is through written print. And so that's why it becomes so pressing for our kids to know how to do it. But understand that that's a value, that that's something that we, not explicitly, but that's something that we came over time to adopt as a cultural group as important. And that's how everything that's in our education system works. We've decided it matters to us, and that's why it's worth doing. And I think at different points in our history, it's worth revisiting that question and thinking again about what matters to us and what's worth doing in this climate now. And sometimes we think the same things we've been doing are the things we should continue to do. And sometimes we think, we might need to change because the climate of the space that we're preparing kids' minds for is different now than it's ever been before. It's more multicultural. It's got more technology. You've got much more interaction with other people than we ever did before. It's more urban. There's more food available. There's so many reasons why our lifestyles now are different than they've ever been. We need to think about what that means for our kids. And rather than letting the technology and the lifestyles and the norms of society press onto us, right? Like this is just how it is. This is the 20th century or whatever, 21st century, right? That's just where I'm at. Instead of just accepting that, we actually are mindful. We're responsible for our own futures and for our children's futures, in a sense, right? We're helping them to build their own, too. They're responsible, too. And we need to think about what we believe in and what we want and why. And we need to continually revisit that conversation with ourselves throughout our lifetimes. And I think that's how I interpret one of the core values of Rosarian Academy, of being reflective, right? That, to me, is what I mean by reflective. I think that's what you meant by it as well. And what I'm going to show you over the course of talking to you about my research is that what we're learning is that the original evolutionary purpose of the brain, right, is to keep your body alive. That's why you have it. Without a brain, your body dies. No question. You can't eat, you can't breathe, you don't do anything, right? Brains evolved in every species that has one, right? right? In every species that can move around, like animals, to control that animal's habits and norms and desires and postures so that it can engage in patterns of behaviors that are adaptive for it, that'll make it comfortable, that'll make it live well and survive and flourish and prosper. But what we're learning is that that embodied brain, the brain that evolved to maintain our, what as scientists we call homeostasis, right? The regulated, balanced functioning of our bodily organism is not now sort of divorced from or separate from our acculturated, educated mind. Instead, the mind that we bring is built out of the experience of living in a body. And the very same parts of our brain that have evolved to manage our bodily survival in the basic sense, in terms of consciousness, in terms of regulating your digestion, right, and your blood pressure, and the chemistry of your blood and your hormones, and all these things that you need to be able to live in the literal sense, are literally over the course of development and education being reused and repurposed and specialized as processors that contribute to our acculturated mind. So we're literally building out of a brain that controls our body the ability to have values and complex cognition of the sort that we care about in education. And I'll show you what I mean by this. It's not just metaphor. The same brain parts that are controlling your guts and tell you if you have a stomachache are the ones that allow you to feel compassion, for example, or moral disgust, right? The same brain systems that make you, puke if you see bad food, right, are the ones that are active when you see bad morals. What does that tell you about the embeddedness of our mental and values-oriented culture within the biological substrate of our survival as an organism and as a species, where our very survival is tied to our ability to understand and to represent ourselves in that make meaning. And so what we see is that that embodied brain is not acting as if all things were neutral, right? It doesn't matter to the brain whether you whack into a wall or you steer down the aisle. No, right? That brain is there. That brain is there to steer you, right? So that you act in a way that's good for your body. What's good? Whatever feels good to you. That's what is good for you. Think about what that means, right? Even if the rest of the world's looking at you and saying, like, that's not very adaptive. To you, you do it because it seems like it's the comfortable way to do it. And so what we're finding is that this embodied brain, this embodied brain is actually giving rise to a mind that is steered fundamentally by its emotions. Emotions are the thing that drive our thinking and not the other way around. There's a famous article by a guy named John Haidt that I really love called The Emotional Dog and Its Rational Tail. I think he has that totally right. And we see this even with brain-damaged patients who lose their ability to feel normal emotion. It's a very rare kind of brain damage, but it can happen. What happens when these people don't feel normal emotion is that their IQs stay exactly what they were before. You have no change in their intelligence in the traditionally conceived sense, right? But what happens is these people's lives fall apart. So there's a famous patient, for example, who had this kind of brain damage. Before the brain damage, he had an IQ of 140. He was a genius. He was the mayor of his town, of a Midwest town. Everybody loved him, right? They voted for him into mayor. He was happily married, he had children, he had a very successful business, and he got a particular kind of nasal abscess. This was quite a few decades ago. Now we treat these much more aggressively. But he got a kind of nasal abscess that caused brain damage in the part of his brain that we call the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. It's kind of resting underneath your eyes and over the back of your sinus cavities. So when you get a really bad nasal abscess, you can actually infect that part of your brain and kill it, right? Kill those cells, and that's what happened to him. And what his family noticed, and what quickly clinicians noticed, is that even though his IQ stayed exactly the same when you sat him down and tested him, his life fell apart. His business ventures went to heck because he had no emotion to steer him to say, well, this seems risky, or that seems like a good idea. He would just trust anybody who said anything to him. And then he'd start to figure it out and think, wow, well, I don't know, this sounds good, and he'd just go off and run with like some woman who wasn't his wife, and his wife ended up divorcing him. And then he gets in fights, and then his kids couldn't be with him because he'd get so angry and throw these big temper tantrums they had to leave, right? All of a sudden, this guy's emotions, because they weren't connected to his thinking, were running his life in a way that was completely maladaptive. They were just immediate and serving right here, right now. His attention and all of his ability to think complexity is still there, but he can't use it for anything because he can't sense that little feeling of how his emotions warn you and sort of give you the idea like, this, I don't think this is a good idea. This seems right, or that's just wrong. And it might be advantageous for me as a businessman, but it's not what I'm going to do. And all of those decisions we make every day, those we need to appreciate are fundamentally oriented towards our values and our cultural ways of feeling emotions. And when we try to pretend like pulling the emotion out of your thinking is actually making it better, we do ourselves a disservice because we take away our awareness of the fact that things are cultural and values oriented, rather than becoming explicit about what we believe and why, and examining those beliefs over and over throughout our lifetime so that they become updated with new situations, so that we think again about, well, I used to believe this, but what do I want to believe now? The world's changing. Well, maybe I still want to believe the same thing, or maybe I don't. But we need to stop and use our internal compass as a way to guide ourselves through that process. And for those of you who have children who are entering adolescence, you especially need them to be able to do that. This is the age where for the first time, I mean, I'm with you, I have an eighth grade daughter too, right? This is the age for the first time where they're really able to make some decisions out with their friends a little bit about what kind of person am I? How do I want other people to see me? What kind of beliefs and values really matter to me as a person? And what does that mean for what I do? Those kinds of questions, those true reflection questions, are not disembodied, and they're not separate from our emotions. It's ability to integrate our cognition, our thinking, our complex perspective taking, and our knowledge about the world together via our educational and academic skills that allow us to analyze and take perspectives and think about things multiple ways, and all the things that schooling teaches you. And we put it together to make decisions that are inherently grounded in what we think is good and right. And that's good thinking. That's good thinking. So, just to begin as a metaphor, this is the painting Margaret Rosarian did. She allowed me to put this on the cover of the book, which was so lovely. She's a professor of fine arts at USC, and she was the chair of the fine arts department, and she paints these beautiful paintings that have sort of hidden meaning inside biological themes. And what she painted here is this gorgeous, huge seascape, which in real life is vibrant color. And if you can sort of look in the middle, there's these white squiggly things floating, which, you know, to me kind of look like waves on the water. To my son, they look like, you know, clouds reflecting. But what they actually are is brain data. They're actually a picture of one young woman's brain who came into one of my experiments, who agreed to let us use the data this way. And what we did was we peeled off the outside of her brain all of the little cells, all the little neurons that are doing the firing, that are doing the thinking, right? So we peeled those off the picture, not off the lady, okay? Just so you know. And what's left underneath is the massively interconnected billions of little microscopic white sacs of salt water, little tubes of salt water called axons that are connecting those neurons to each other across the space of your head and down into your body, so that your brain acts not just as a bunch of single neurons, but as a concerted network of billions of cells interacting with each other in patterns that are so complex we're only just beginning to start to understand them. And what Margaret's done with those data, which I love as a metaphor for how I understand the brain and development, is she hasn't taken, you know, kind of the brain and sort of put it in the corner in a bucket and, like, you know, we all put on our special glasses and, like, study the kind of brain that kid has. Oh, dyslexic brain, ADD brain, happy brain, like what order it's, okay? Instead, what she's done is she's taken the connectivity of the middle of that brain all the networks that are being built by that person, by virtue of their genetics, by virtue of their experiences, and she's painted it into this massive seascape of life. She's got it sort of floating, semi-translucent on the waves of this living ocean. She's got little weeds growing up through the bottom poking of it. She's got little red fish swimming by to represent the spontaneity of our creative ideas. She's got the sun shining down, warming it through the top. And what I love about this is that that's how the brain actually develops and functions. What we're learning is that our brains, when we look inside them, reflect organizations that come from our culture, not from our racial background, but from our cultural exposure. Some of my work that I've recently been publishing looks at how people who lived in China versus who lived in the United States, who are Asian, or who lived in the United States who are not of Asian descent, how their brains reflect those experiences over time. There's not different amounts of activity in the different brains. There's not different amounts of thinking in the different brains. But the ways in which the activity and thinking are organized are shaped by people's experiences. What that tells us is that we learn it. We learn how to think. We organize the very biological substrate on which thinking happens through our experiences using that substrate to think. Think how importantly that speaks to your role as parents, as teachers, in engaging kids and yourselves in meaningful learning activities. Right? What that means is that as you're thinking, as you're engaging, as you're making your own personal meaning out of your world, you're struggling to grow those networks so that they're coming together in ways that make you you, so that you can go back to them later and relive them and reuse them as you learn new things or as you face new situations. That's what learning actually is. It's an active process on the part of the person. It is impossible to really teach anybody anything. You can't learn somebody something, right? I can sort of orchestrate the world for you so that you've got everything you need to be able to teach it to yourself. That's what teaching is. Even if I'm drugged out telling you this right now, I'm telling you stuff, right? I'm not teaching it to you, I'm just telling you it. You're the one who's got to sit there and think, really? Does she make any sense, right? And you've got to start building it into something that reconciles with your own experiences. And you're thinking to yourself, is that what I've experienced? Does that seem to explain what I know about how people grow and think? And as you engage in that kind of meaning-making process, that's you learning. Me talking at you is just me providing you with some fodder for you to do your own learning with. So, what is that a picture of? It's not me. I never put pictures of myself in my talks. It's actually my sister. Yeah. And my new little niece, Nina. Nina was about 2 hours old. Nina was born when she was about 3 3/4 pounds. She was the smaller of a pair of twins, and they were born in an emergency C-section with both Nina and her sister Abby and my sister were all anesthetized. And this is the first time that Nina and her mom have met each other when they're both awake. And I put this in here as a kind of reminder that this is where it starts. I mean, I once heard a really famous neuroscientist, a neurophilosopher, whose work I really like, but I think she's wrong about this one, talk about, and she was sort of joking, but she talked about human infants as sausages. And I think what she meant is that, they're kind of squashy and they're sort of pokey and juicy and all that, pink. But I was thinking in my mind, you know what? There's a major difference between a human infant and a sausage. And if you just remember this, you go home and say, Mary Ellen taught me something. There's a difference between a human infant and a sausage. Great, okay. Anyway, don't repeat that, all right? Don't tell it to the newspapers either. But what it is a sausage, you put it on a plate and it stays there. It's passive, it just receives. Human beings are never passive like that in normal health. We come to the world ready to engage. In this case, we bring biological predispositions toward sociality. We bring with us innate instincts that are built into our biology by our birthright that then become shaped and developed and drawn out and specialized over the course of our development and our education into skills, acculturated skills that matter in this world for us now. And that's a social process that's supported. So if you think about it, what does Nina bring here? It's kind of hard to see with the bright light, but maybe you can see, right? What does Nina bring? She comes with, among other things, besides just the ability to regulate herself and breathe and all that, which, you know, we can't take for granted, okay? You take it for granted until your child can't do it, and then you remember really hard how much you need it, okay? She comes with, built into her visual system, an innate reflex to look for two dark dots in that kind of configuration. Not like that, not three, not flashing, not too far apart, right? Two, like that. And then along comes her mother, or her father, or whoever is raising her, and says, hey, baby, you've got this biological reflex that you're just waiting to turn on. Let me show you what you can use that for in the real world. Let me help you tune that reflex and specialize it so that it becomes a skill that's your entry point into social communication and relationships for the rest of your life. And we know, for example, that cultural differences exist in how people hold their babies, right? The distance at which we talk to babies, all these kinds of things. And what we also know is that over the course of our development, that shapes our brain to expect certain kinds of distances in eye gaze. Has anyone ever, I'm sure many of you have lived in places where the norms for eye gaze are different than the ones you grew up with, right? Like I lived in Kenya for a while, right? And people there, you know, at first it felt like everybody was staring at me like too long. Like, why are you still looking? Like, what? You know what I mean? Okay? That's just normal variation across human beings. It's not genetic, it's learned. And after a while, I got comfortable with it. And then my parents came, and my mom was like, why is everybody staring at me? Right? We learn that, and we tune it by our early interactions. And all of our learning is like this. This is just a metaphor, but all of our learning is like this. We come to the world as infants with predispositions, with biologically given propensities toward thinking in particular ways, toward processing in particular ways, toward feeling in particular ways. And then the social world welcomes us, and we engage with it. And as we're engaging and actively trying to shape and make meaning out of the experiences we're having, what happens is you're tuning those biological mechanisms to be more appropriate for your culture. And what we see is over time this kind of resonance between people until our very biological growth is shaped by and reflecting the way in which we've been grown up and educated and acculturated and left. And if you think this is just sort of, you know, pushy metaphor, there's a really poignant example, a tragic example in the world of a time, you know, of kids who were not raised with an adequate amount of social stimulation. Like, for example, Chuck Nelson and Nathan Fox and other people's study of the institutionally raised children in Romania. And they went into that study, I think, expecting that children who are living in those institutions, which, by the way, have food, have water, have beds, have heated buildings, have some toys, have the kids with each other. What they don't have is families. What they don't have is committed adult caregivers who love the kids and who bring those kids with them into their lives as a member of their own family, who show them how to be a human being. And I think we expected that we would see sort of cognitive delays in these kids and, you know, social ineptitude, kind of awkwardness, and maybe emotional dysregulation. What they actually found is 17-year-old kids who are 3 feet tall. You cannot grow in the absence of social relationships that are meaningful. Those kids' brains are literally undeveloped little shriveled things in their heads. Their hippocampi, which are learning and memory, are literally smaller than their counterparts who've grown up in foster families. Our biology biology at this late stage in our evolution is entirely interdependent with our relationships and with our social sphere of influence. We are biologically social beings, and our learning in schools has to come to reflect that more effectively. And that does not mean that we always have to learn in groups. What it means is we always have to learn information by reflecting on its cultural relevance, by thinking about what's this for, what is this good for, how does this help me help the world? Is there a question over here? Yeah.
I have a question about the spinner talk.
Yeah. Yeah, the B.F. Skinner's children turned out all right. They're fine, right? And you're familiar with, these are classic psychology experiments, which these days would be considered unethical. But at that time, you know, that's what happened. So B.F. Skinner tried to control the environment that his children were raised in as infants, so that they would have optimal learning and growth. And that came all the way to like trying to control the temperature of their bassinet and all these kinds of things. And he tried to teach them how to live in that kind of a sort of response environment. But the bottom line is those kids still had parents who were there and who were caring about them, and they did fine. The kids who don't do fine are the ones who don't have parents there caring about them. Yeah. There's a wide variety of normal among humans. There's a wide variety of cultural variability in how we raise our children and what we think about as appropriate for norms about where kids sleep and for how long they're alone and for what age kids take care of them and all these kinds of things. There's a broad range across the human species, but no group leaves its children like isolated on their own when they're young and expects them to grow up healthy.
Does the reverse happen? In other words, does the brain atrophy if they've been interacting with adults and people, so their brains grow, but then they're isolated?
Will it go back again?
Yes.
That's a good question, and the only real data we have on that, because it's unethical to actually, when you rescue kids from abusive situations, then subject them to abuse again, right? The only real data that we have on that comes from animal studies. And so there are studies with rats and with cats and with monkeys that show that, yes, these things are relatively dynamic and they can change throughout the lifetime. So there are critical periods in which an animal does, or a person does, need to have exposure to species-specific ways of thinking and being, right? For example, in human beings, one of the main things that we have a critical window for, it seems like, is language. If children are not spoken to, by the time they're at a particular developmental stage, or age, I should say, they have a difficult time learning language forever, right? We, as a species, must talk to our children. And, you know, the kids, we know this from our kids who were literally, you know, just excruciatingly badly abused, who were locked in closets and things like that. But we see later when they're rescued, they don't learn to speak well. But with animals, what they see is that, for example, dendritic spines, so the tiny little microscopic growth of those neurons that are making the white networks in that painting, right? Those reflect learning. And they're trying new pathways, and then they prune back the ones that don't matter. Like, more is not better, right? It's like growing a garden. You don't want to have more and more and more plants in your backyard, okay? What you need is to have, like, you know, a shade tree in the corner where you need some shade, and a path to the little koi pond, and that has, like, you know, grass around it, and in the middle a big open spot where you can sunbathe, right? You need to have, like, appropriate plants planted for how you're going to use it. The brain's just like that. Okay? A gigantic jungle in your backyard would not be a fun way to use your backyard. Okay? The brain's just like this. What we see is those spines grow, looking for outputs and for connections so that they can make meaningful ones. And then if for example, rats are then put again in, from enriched environments back into impoverished ones, you see that shrink back again. So it does appear to be dynamic, and it does appear to be dynamic across the lifespan in animals, in rats. So if it is in rats, it almost certainly is in human beings. So it's just not true that older people don't learn things or that your brains aren't still growing. If they're growing in different ways and they're adjusting and moving, but you're changing your brain all the time through the process of thinking and acting and being and exercising. Exercise is key. So I'm going to tell you a story. This is a true story about this woman in the blue dress. I actually knew her. And if you look she's holding up a book that shows like anatomy for pregnant women, right? The physiology, and she's teaching it to these other women. And she's in a really arid place, which turns out to be Sudan. And this woman's story is that she grew up as a child in a goat herding family that was nomadic in the very rural and arid part of Sudan. And what that meant for her is that she and her family group traveled together with their goats, and they almost never crossed paths with other groups. Occasionally they did, but she had no access to schooling, and her family hadn't either. They just were nomadic tribes who were illiterate and who had this cultural way of being. It also meant that they had no access to medical care. And this girl, like many girls in her generation who had very poor access to medical care and to education and to schooling, found herself when she was 13 years old alone with her mother when her mom went into labor with her baby sister. And unable to learn what to do or to help in any way, she basically just stood by and tried to comfort her mother as her mother and her baby sister died in front of her. And as she began to make sense out of that, it's called doctors, she decided she wanted to be one because she wanted to help other people not have to suffer the kind of loss that she had in her mother. And her 16-year-old girl, she had, heard of these, but she never even been to school. And 2 years later, she heard of a family from Cambridge, England. The mom was a sociologist, the dad was an anthropologist, and they were coming there from the university with their 2 school-age girls to Sudan to do field work for 2 years. And she basically walked to them and presented herself and said, as they say in Sudan, I want to be your house girl. I want to cook for you and clean for you and take care of your 2 girls who are working during the day. And so they hired her on. And over the course of those 2 years, every day as those 2 little girls would sit down with their British school books, she would sit with them and ask them to explain to her what they were learning, both as a way for them to know it better and as a way for her to learn the basics of the math they were learning and other subjects. And when the 2 years were up, the family were so taken with her that they offered her to learn it. And over the course of those 2 years, those 2 little girls taught her how to read, and support her with them. She wanted to come back to England in the service of her own education. And she decided to go. She left her family, she left her country, she went to a country across the globe that was completely different than what she was used to, and basically began her own course of education in the West. She went on through a high school equivalency degree and then into university. From university, she graduated and got accepted to medical school. And from medical school, she became a fully trained and certified gynecologist obstetrician in Europe. And at that point, she could have very easily stayed in Europe and still led a very affluent life and sent money back to her native Sudan, but she didn't do that. She returned to Sudan, where she now operates out of a truck, a mobile health clinic, where she drives into the most remote regions of the country and teaches women how to care for themselves and each other during pregnancy, childbirth, and the postnatal period. So now that you know who this person is, a little bit about her in that picture, what's going on, I can just ask you a simple question. How does this person's story make you feel? What do you mean when you say inspired? Can you all hear? She said inspired, find a passion, follow it, make it happen. Right? Yeah?
It's also a necessity, though.
It's a necessity.
She saw something or that she knew that there was something that she had to do out of necessity so that no one else would go through what she went through, experience, which don't necessarily want anyone else to go through. So out of necessity, she wanted to learn something and educate herself. I don't know what you would call that. Necessity.
Like recognizing that there's a real need to learn something here, and that drives you, and undoubtedly even through the hard times, right? Which I'm sure there were plenty of. Yeah?
Yeah, it seems to me it's more of a sort of evolution of Muhammad or Rosarian who struggle with bread and you pull yourself up. But it also equally reflects on when society affluent and entitled it's not as strong, it's not as great, and not as things. And so I feel sad for the abundance that adult clinics have that provide for many people to basically not be driven. And yet, if someone comes from nothing in a third world country and does all these accomplishments, they're both given in some cases. But look at the affluent entitled to society versus this.
You asked how we felt, and I felt great sadness because of her loss. Because of her loss, her love is what propelled her to have that, because of that experience in her family. And it's a very basic need to be loved, and therefore to walk all that way, to be driven, to be the doctor, so that she could share the love, and then come back to her country. So it's like a full circle.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm going to take off my storyteller's hat for a minute and put on my scientist hat and tell you, hers is one of the true stories that we studied, that we compiled in my lab to study what we were calling admiration for virtue, but which quickly I renamed inspiration, because that's what everybody says, right? Because what is admiration for another person's virtue? It's the feeling in yourself that you should be a better person and that you should learn for how the world ought to be. Like, what kind of people could we be, right? You use them, you set them as an example against which you measure the behavior of other people, including yourself, and say, well, these entitled athletes, how come they're not, but this person can, so it is possible, right? And we use them as sort of a standard against which we measure ourselves, and from there, we produce this kind of heightened sense of really intrinsically motivated purposefulness to do better ourselves. And that's what people often mean, I think, when you ask them what they mean when they say they're inspired. Even teenagers tell me in response to stories like this one, she makes me think, what could I be doing in my world, right, that would be better? And what we did to conduct the science, because this was the first ever study of an emotion like admiration, because neuroscientists didn't know how to induce that kind of, how do you get people to feel inspired in an fMRI scanner where it's loud and you can't move and you gotta keep doing it over again and stop 100 times, right? Turns out it was a lot of work for me, but quite straightforward. Tell people true stories about real people's accomplishments and tragedies, and bam, you got it. We are a species that tells stories and reacts to stories. We interpret our own lives by the stories we build. And the stories and the narratives that we construct around why things happen the way they do reflect not just our emotions in the sort of basic sense, but our skills, our cognitive skills, our ability to think in nuanced ways about very complex kinds of problems. Problems in the social world, but also problems in economics, problems in business, problems in physical science, problems in any domain you care to mention. This is how the problem solvers talk about it. Talk to mathematicians, and they say, gosh, there's this issue we need to solve because we could understand better and predict better how, whatever it is that's going on, right? We become connected to and grounded in the emotions that allow us to appreciate the disciplinary content we're engaging with. That's what I'm going for in schooling. We don't do that enough in schooling, but that's what real thinking is. And you don't have to be an expert to engage that. You can engage that in an age-appropriate way all the way from the beginning of your life. You start by owning it, by becoming an expert on dinosaurs when you're 4, right? Nobody expects you to be a paleoanthropologist. It's just that, you know what? It's fun to know a lot about something interesting that isn't real in my real life, but that's imagined, and I have to actually imagine another time to be able to appreciate. We need more of that, because that's the actual way in which kids and adults learn by need, right? By necessity, and by grounding themselves in the actual feeling of what matters. And that's what I meant about emotion driving our learning and our thinking at the beginning. It's like emotions are the glue that hold our life stories together. Think about your memories and your history and who you are as a person. What stands out is the history of emotional experiences, the things that you subjectively perceive as mattering to you over time, are the things that are holding a coherent narrative about who you are as a person. The things that questioned or that strengthened your resolve or your morals or your values or your beliefs. The happenings that made you dig in and work harder, or the lessons you learned when you didn't. Those are the meaningful moments that are pivotal, that are brought together as you reflect and build yourself a life story and say, who am I as a person? And especially children into adolescence are just working on building who they are as people. When they're little ones, who they are is actions. It's engaging with the environment. It's engaging with their little friends. It's learning to listen to other people and to share with other people and to be kind and notice how they feel and share with them how you feel in culturally appropriate ways. And as they get older, they begin to think about ideas and systems of ideas and how could we help our community and do. One little girl asked me today, when I told her about the Romanian orphans, and all this stuff, she asked me, well, is that why elderly people who lose their spouse and get really sad, is that why they get shorter? There's a kid who's really thinking about and empathizing with that elderly person who lost their spouse, and maybe she knows one. Right? That's real learning right there. Because I guarantee you the answer I gave, which explained all the biology and the relationships and the health factors and all that, she'll remember that, you know, because that matters. If I just said, memorize this, over the age span, the following changes happen. A, bone muscle density declines. B, relationships become, okay? You get it. Okay. I'm just going to because that's an example of one of the guys in my experiment. Just one of the young people in my experiment actually reacting to a story. It's interesting to see what people do. You guys really want to see a video of somebody doing it? Oh, you do? You want me to go back? Let's move on, and I'll show it at the end if we want to, okay? Because I'm going to skip straight to the brain bit now, because I want to have lots of time for discussion in here. We got a long evening together, and I'd rather not, spend the whole time with me talking. I'd rather let you guys start to really engage. So I want to get straight to the brain, and what we basically learned. This is Gilbert. This is Nina's older brother. Okay, I know, little guy. He's adopted from Guatemala. Is that feeling emotions involves the very same brain systems that feel and regulate your body and keep you alive. That's not just metaphor. I'm actually going to show you that. And meaningful learning. The kind of learning that's deep, that stays, that lasts through your lifetime, that actually changes who you are and what you're capable of as a person. Not just changes what kind of grade you got or what somebody said about it or something like that, but actually who you are as a person always involves emotion. Always, by definition. It is actually literally neurobiologically impossible to think deeply about or remember information that you have absolutely no emotion about. It's impossible. Your brain won't do it. Because why should it? It's a waste of energy. So what do? You see, that can't be true, right? I always learned all this stuff in X class, whatever, fill in the class. I don't want to offend anybody, okay? That I didn't care about, but I just had to learn it. You made yourself care. And if you didn't care enough, along came all the societal factors that say, well, if you don't care, you're not going to get into that college you want to go to. And if you don't care, you're going to get an X kind of grade on your paper. And if you don't care, everybody else is going to think you're stupid and make you stay in on Saturday and do extra homework, right? We find a way to make you care. Okay? And sometimes a little bit of that is necessary. I got to admit it. Okay, sometimes it is. But here's the thing. Remember that the brain makes memories around the thought processes that you had emotions around. Whatever it was you cared about, that's the thing you're going to remember. Did you care about the grade, or did you care about the concepts? If you cared about the grade, what you're going to remember is the grades. Makes sense? So whenever you find yourself using those kinds of extrinsic labels to try to get kids to do stuff, you know that there's not enough internal interest going on. And sometimes they just have to get over the hump somehow, and you need a little bit of that external drive to make them get there so they can get enough done so they can go on. But most of the time, it's a sign that the education's not effective, that they need to find ways to care, that they need to find ways to use that information and those skills so that the work is worth it because they know what they need it for. When they ask you, why do I need to know this? That's a red flag, ding, ding, ding. You ought to know why you need to know it. Because if you don't, you're not going to know it. You can't make your brain learn stuff you don't care about. How much stuff do you remember that never mattered to you in the first place? You remember the stuff that matters. The rest of it you forget. And if you're me, you forget a lot that matters too. But anyway, okay. So I'm going to show you in the brain. This is a picture of one subject's brain, one participant's brain, okay, a young woman who was in our experiment. This is her nose, right, her tongue, okay? And what I'm going to show you is the data from 17 people, superimposed, averaged, and warped around in space so it fits in her head. That's how we do it, okay? So that we ask the statistics, basically, when I have people first in an interview with me where they sit for 2 hours and they respond on videotape to all these different stories, like one from Sudan is one of them, okay? And then we move them into the MRI scanner. We ask them to lay quietly and think about each story. We show them it again, almost like a little small documentary, like a mini documentary. And we ask them to think about how it makes them feel, to reflect. And then when they know how they feel, to push buttons to tell us, like not very strong, all the way up to like, I'm really overwhelmed with emotion right now. And we make really clear what we mean by that. And what we did for the first analysis is we just took all the places in the brain that across all those people, when they said they felt really inspired or really compassionate, turns out they don't look that different at this level, which is also interesting. Where in the brain is there reliably more blood flowing? And let's paint that orange so that we can see it. And where in the brain is there reliably less blood flowing? And let's just paint that blue. And here's what we found. Okay, so first, we're looking into the middle of the brain this way. And one of our major hypotheses, which was really kind of sacrilegious, even though this was only a few years ago, is that these really complex emotions like admiration for virtue, which are arguably among the most complex, difficult emotions to have for human beings. These things really, you have to know a lot and think a lot before you can really admire that woman from Sudan in the way that you do, right? And 5-year-olds don't really get it. They think she's nice and they want to be a doctor too and go help her, right? And 15-year-olds don't even really get it most of the time. They say things to be like, wow, she's a good person. She did the right thing, right? That's not the same as, wow, let me think about this whole political systems of people and what this means about how affluence can change your desire to achieve, right? Okay, that's an adult. Okay, you get it. Sorry to pick on you, sir. Okay. Those complex emotions, what we wanted to know is, are they actually activating not just all this high-level cortical stuff up here? Okay, so this is a slice from this way. This is a slice from this way, right? So it's like we took a slice across this way and we turned it up on its end. So this is the forehead and this is the back of the head. And you slice right through like that, okay? So we can see. And I showed those slices because I wanted to show you some of our hypotheses. First one is that when people feel subjectively moved by those kind of stories, as compared to when they're thinking about stories that are equally complex but they don't really find them particularly moving, and unbeknownst to them, we actually had some of those mixed in, right? Would they literally activate these systems all the way down here at the bottom of their brainstem? So this is the cortex. This down here, you see where I'm pointing? I know it's kind of hard to see. Look at this real quick. Here. This stuff we share with alligators. Okay? It's way down deep in the middle of the inside of our head. Why? Because evolution moved it there on purpose, because, you know, if it's over near the side where it gets whacked, you don't do so well. Okay? What we know is that if you get damage in here, these are little nuclei that are controlling life regulatory functions like consciousness. I mean, compared to coma, okay? Or persistent vegetative state, or locked-in syndrome. You know what that is? It's a horrible thing. Okay? All of those kinds of syndromes emerge from patterns of damage in here. We call it the mesencephalon, the midbrain. Down here, you get to the bottom, this is the spinal cord going into the body. The very bottom little bulb of the brain before you're in spinal cord is the medulla. You can't even live without your medulla. If you damage your medulla, you can't even be kept alive on life support. Your body is completely dysregulated, and you just die within moments. And we wanted to know, when people feel inspired and compassionate, they're telling us, right, and I can show you videos later of other kids too, they're telling us, wow, I want to do things with my life. I feel like awake and alive. I feel like this matters. I gotta do something with my time on this earth. Are they literally modulating the neural substrate of their consciousness? That was the question. And then we had another question, which you can answer by looking over here. In here, these two big folds of tissue, and I think I have a picture from the side, okay? So this is a picture from Grey's Anatomy, right? The textbook, not the TV show. Such a dumb joke that I was saying. All right, here we go. You got the eyeball right here, and you've picked up, resected the top of the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe, and you look inside there, and there's these huge pieces of cortex in there. What do those do, right? So it turns out, we've known from about 1950s, because of a neurosurgeon named Wilder Penfield, who was a famous, brilliant guy. And he was a neurosurgeon before the days of neuroimaging. So he had to use very crude techniques to map and localize functions in his patients' brains before he cut out the centers of seizures, right? Because he wouldn't want to, like, fix Mrs. Jones's seizures, but make her be mute for the rest of her life, right? So you go in there, and you can see where the seizures started. You can measure that with electrodes laying on the surface of the brain, but then you got to poke around and say, like, hey, Miss Jones, what would happen if I, fiddle with this, right? And what he did is he actually, over the course of many, many patients that he saved, he also mapped out what they said when they poked in different places. He made the first functional maps of the human brain. And what happened, he discovered, when you go poking around up in what we call the dorsal anterior insula, the pokey part up here in the top of this triangle, is the person pukes. Sorry. But they get all kinds of gastromotoric responses that I won't really go into detail about, okay? What we knew is that this cortex is controlling your gastromotoric system in the literal sense. You poke in there and the person does stuff with their intestines. But poets have been telling us for centuries, millennia, that when you feel compassion for another human being's mental pain, not physical pain, nothing you can see out of that hurts, but it's what they know or what they've experienced. We describe it as feeling like, a stone in the pit of our stomach or a knife in our heart, these kinds of metaphors. Are those really literally because we co-opt the feeling of our own gut viscera in order to be able to have moral emotions? And what would that mean about the development of morality? Basically, here's what happened with data. So keep in mind what you're looking at. Everywhere that is not colored orange or blue was used the same amount, whether or not you feel inspired. Okay? Visual cortex doesn't much matter if you're inspired. Your eyeballs are still doing their thing. It's nice to know. And down here in the brainstem, these are particular nuclei that we were able to sort of localize, right? And up here, the hypothalamus. You know what this thing does? It controls the chemistry of your blood. It's actually the thing that tells you when you're thirsty, stuff like that. You're literally tasting and changing and adjusting the chemistry of your blood when you feel inspired. These are the nuclei that if you damage, you get coma, persistent vegetative state. This is the medulla, that's the bottom of the field of view of scanner. This is the medulla, you get damage there, can't even keep you alive on life support. That's how fundamental kinds of moral emotion states are to our human survival. That's why I would argue that we care so much about our beliefs and our values. No other animal does this the way we do it. Right? What we do is we get those values get their punch, they get their power. I would argue by literally co-opting and reusing the very same neural substrates that are there to keep you alive in the basic sense and awake. And think about how much cognitive knowledge you had to have to be able to appreciate that woman in the blue dress's situation to the degree that you could actually experience this kind of thing. Cognition and emotion are feeding on one another. They're steering one another. You need to be able to think complexly, to be able to understand the story. You need to have lots of experiences of your own to be able to appreciate how it must have been to be her. You put it all together and you know something about the political state of the world and you integrate all that and you admire her, but you're also thinking about, so what does it mean for the rest of the world, right? All the way down here is activated when you do that. That's meaningful learning. And then there's something else to notice. Something very interesting over here. What's interesting about these cortices in here that are activated, when we began studying this stuff, it actually took us an extra year to publish the data because we didn't know what to make of this. Nobody knew what to do with that. And this was only published in 2009. And I should say, I mean, it was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science and won the best paper of the year. Like, it turned out to be a really important discovery. But we didn't know what to do with it for a year. Why? Because these cortices are so deep down inside the middle of the back of your head that nobody really knew what they did. Now there's been massive amounts of information coming out on them in the last 10 years, huge amounts of information on them. But here's what we knew at the time. They seem to activate when you put people in the scanner and you ask them to please don't think about anything. Just relax. Okay? There was this really clever guy, Marcus Rakel, who in 2001 with his colleagues did this really neat experiment. For the first time, he said, hey, everybody's got this newfangled neuroimaging technology. We're putting people in the scanner, we're making them do math problems, and solve this, and do these wicked hard stuff, and memorize stuff, and see snakes splash in their face, and whatever. Like, we're watching what the brain's all doing, we're learning all this stuff. Hey, what would happen if we put people in the scanner and ask them to please just think about nothing? You know, just relax, don't think about anything. And see what the brain, what he called the brain's default mode would be. Default state. What happened? It's a really weird thing. Out of the brain comes these massive activations in these regions, here and here, okay, which you're only seeing a little bit, but you see a lot of it here and here, okay, which are the most metabolically expensive tissues in the whole cortex. You burn more oxygen in this place of cortex right there when you're just daydreaming and resting than your leg muscles are burning when you're in the middle of a marathon. Per unit area. Why would that be massively activated when you're resting and thinking about nothing? And as soon as he gave them, so he has to make a comparison, he gave them really hard things to think about. Like, here's some really hard math problems in this nasty task called an NBAC task, which psychologists who, you know, hate people design. Anyway, I'm joking. But it studies working memory, right? So they flash things at you, pictures or words, whatever, and you have to keep saying, when you see a match that happened N times before. 3 times ago, was it a house? And then you see another house. Okay, but now 3 times ago is now 2 times ago, but now it's a new house. You know what I mean? Like, it's super hard. And as soon as people started to do that task, these areas were shut, stopped activating while they did the task. Well, now, of course, we know what happens when you put somebody in a scanner and you say, don't think about anything. For a few seconds later, and you think, oh, I'm not thinking about anything. Now I'm thinking, hey, I wonder about my grandma's birthday next week. I should be doing something about that. I wonder if that guy in my class yesterday was kind of mad. Because I don't know if he was just like not feeling it or if he might have been mad at me. Let me think about it. And you know what I mean? You start thinking about yourself and the world and the values and the stuff that doesn't exist here and now. What does yours mean? Winning the Olympics? Right? You're imagining that. That's unlikely to happen in the real world, okay? Right? And then you're thinking about stuff that happened, chewing on memories, but you're not listing out the state capitals. You're thinking about the things you've lived. And you're constructing those memories into a coherent story you're telling yourself. You're making daydreams that are built from reality with also some fantasy. You're building that all up together. And what we discovered here, this was the first functional task. That means the first active task where you ask somebody to do something and you actually get activation back here. Whoops, sorry. And what was it that we asked people to do? Feel emotions that reflect your sense of self, morals, and values. What we learned is that those internal sense of values are played out on the substrate of your own ability to imagine things that don't exist. Values don't exist in the real physical sense. And other animals can't perceive them. We create them together out of conventions, out of emotions, out of cognitions about what should be and isn't. Now here's the kicker that really matters for you and your kids. We know something else about these regions of the brain, which I basically just gave away. When you're doing a task that directs your attention into the world, pay attention, watch out, whoa, watch those things, make sure that if it's 3 times ago, you click the button, and like, okay? These regions are profoundly suppressed in activation. When you're on task, quote unquote, in the traditional sense, and you're listening to the teacher, you're listening to the stuff, or you're playing your video game, and you're watching, and you're shooting, and you're doing whatever it is you're doing, you're not reflecting and making meaning out of your memories and building a coherent story out of it. And what we think, and we're actually testing this hypothesis now longitudinally, that means like with the same kids watching their brains grow over time, adolescence, what we're showing is that kids who engage in playing action video games and stuff more have less activation in these regions. When you just ask them the scanner to just relax. And when you're at the end, ask them, hey, what were you thinking about? They also think about less social, less planful, less moral content. So it sort of all makes the story. We have kids from inner city neighborhoods, poor immigrant neighborhoods in Los Angeles. These kids are good students, right? And they come from stable families, but they're in poor neighborhoods and they're first-generation immigrants, either Latino or East Asian American background. We ask those kids, why do you think people do the crimes in your neighborhood that you see? Why do you think that happens? And what could be done about it? Is there anything you can think about to be done about it? And we look at the complexity of those answers. You know, everything from what I would label a not very sophisticated answer, like, no, nothing can be done at all. Wait, this one can be, wait, I can think of one thing. How you would stop the violence in my neighborhood. If somebody went out and rounded up and killed all the people who believe in violence, then there would no longer be any violence. Like, and then when I was the guy who rounded up the people who committed violence, right? Okay, that doesn't make sense. Okay, but the kids were coming up with answers that are sophisticated, like, well, I think there's real problems, and here's how you can help them, and if you have blah, 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 and they've got real reasons and ideas about it, those kids are showing more activation here. Not in our samples, but in normative samples, these activation patterns are associated with IT intelligence, reading comprehension, memory ability. In elderly people, the preservation of that pattern is associated with not losing your ability to have memory. And the question is this: by exposing our kids to a generation of forces around them that the human brain has never experienced and developed before, we know that the way we use our brain is shaping the way it grows. I already showed you that at the beginning. So if we've got our kids constantly being interrupted by little dinging gadgets, like my friend texted me and this and blah, 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 and all this stuff, and it's dinner time, but I'm still playing around with it, you know what I mean? And not here and now and looking at each other and spending time with their friends face to face in your living room, like, you know, or even talking on the phone, heaven forbid, that's what we did when we were teenagers, me at least, okay? Or, you know, interacting with your parents in ways that are actually not just snippets of conversation, but that are meaningful conversations where you're actually thinking together about stuff and sharing. Are we actually shaping the development of their brains so that they're more oriented, sort of readier to engage the network that looks for actions and appearances and here and now stuff, and you know, entertain me, as compared to the network that allows you to build the coherent, complex narrative over time that says, this is what I stand for. This is what it all means to me. We don't know the answer to that question, but we're getting more and more data that's showing that we might be right. And what this means is not that you throw out your kids' social media, right? I told you, I've got an 8th grader, right? And a 5th grader, right? But what it means is that as parents, you need to actually take a stand and show your kids what's healthy for them. You're responsible for you're not responsible for them directly. You're responsible for the conditions that force them or allow them, if you want to think of it that way, to be healthy and teach themselves to be healthy, right? And certain things aren't healthy. And you're the parent, and you gotta say that, even if somebody doesn't like you. Like, cell phones turn off at night, for sure. They don't wake you up in the middle of the night. There's nobody who needs to talk to you. You can't call the home phone and get your dad and mom first, okay? And then, and this part is up to you, what works for you as a family. But you also, I think, need to find time where you're together, and that's where the attention is. And where your kid has real time with their friends, where they're together, and that's what they're attending to. They're attending to each other. They're having fun. They're joking around, or they're playing ball, whatever it is they're doing. But they're not looking at pictures on Facebook and doing it. They're together, enjoying each other's company. And some families do that on the weekends. Some do it at breakfast. Some do it at dinner. You know. But you have to find time to do it, I think. Because when we get in this mode, and you know it doesn't feel good to you either, right, as a parent, this doesn't to me. When you get in that mode where you're like, do it, check the email, do the stuff, cook the dinner, do the thing, your children almost stuff, get in bed, it's 9 o'clock, okay, now what, right? Like, where's my life in that? You know? You just gotta pick your head up one day and you go like, what am I doing, right? I got a little bit like that, sometimes I do when my work gets overwhelming and I'm just like, and my little 13-year-old, now 14-year-old daughter left me little notes, Post-it notes, stuck right in the middle of my computer monitor for me when I found it first thing in the morning when I got up to work. And I'm trying to remember what it said. It said, to my dear mommy, or something like that. Please tell me, what do you plan to do with the remainder of your one and most precious life? It's like, okay, time to step back. She's right? Well, what am I doing here? Engage, okay? So, what we've shown biologically is that emotions, and biological drives that undergird emotions, things like sex and hunger and breathing and all that kind of stuff, are there to keep you alive and well. Right? That's what makes the species go on. That's what makes your body live. You don't eat, you don't do well. And by the way, another thing, this is my opinion, labeled as such. But as a scientist, I've seen a lot of data, and it's my interpretation of it. When you don't have a strong sense of that internal self, right? That's the self that's not about the actions and controlling the actions, it's about being you. What happens is that you get weird biases in your actions. And we're seeing things like addictions to cell phones. That's actually a documented phenomenon. Like real addiction. I'm not talking about a kid who just doesn't like to turn it off at dinner. I'm talking about a kid who is like, cannot go to school because they can't turn their phone off and they have to go to the emergency room to get help. Okay? Which is like 8% of the Pew Research Center now has documented that something like 8% of kids between the age of 10 and 18 in the United States is what could be considered clinically addicted to social media. 8%. We're talking clinical addiction to the point where it's interfering with their life in multiple domains. Not just their mom doesn't think it's a good idea. Okay. Oh, the upswing of eating disorders, right? What's that? I'm defining myself by what I do and look like. I don't have anything else to say. Okay. Because among people, right, survival and wellness aren't just eating and being warm anymore. It's being loved, being accepted, and being part of the group that you want to be part of. That's biologically felt. But we create it for ourselves. And we have the power to change it and to build it how we think is healthy. this I left it here from the teachers before. This is like little second graders paper where I was like, hey, can I have that? Thanks, we need right? Little girl was answering the story about, it's supposed to teach honesty, okay, the story of the empty pot with the emperor, and he boils the flower seeds, and then he makes all the kids ask him to grow a flower, and whoever gets those beautiful flowers is going to be the next emperor. And then, you know, of course he boiled the seeds, so they're all dead, and only one kid actually admitted that his flower didn't grow, and everybody else said, you know, went and found another seed and grew something beautiful. And of course the kid whose flower didn't grow is the next emperor, right? What can you learn from the story of the empty pot in second grade? You can learn that you should always be honest. Suppose someone caught you trying to be dishonest. How would you feel? I would feel shivery and ashamed of myself. Who taught this little second grader that when you are socially and morally estranged from other people, that feels like physical distance in the sense of literally being cold, right? Our embodied experience is the substrate for our neural and social meaning making. Let's get this, hold on a second. I already told you this a different way to make it more visual. Come on. Next. My computer's saying, no, you can't. There we go. Okay, this is our sort of stuff I already told you about. So I'm going to jump up and skip ahead. These are people being really inspired. And we showed that individual variability in how teenagers feel inspired. Very well. Sorry, okay, is actually predicting the amount of brain development you see in that system. That's basically what this shows. And I already told you though, so I'm just going to skip it. So we come back around to the moral of the story, which is emotions are the glue. Emotions are the thing that really matters. We got to find ways to feel emotions that are the ones that are going to help us. And there's kind of no cheating in that. And what that means is we really have to teach our kids and ourselves how to feel. We have to appreciate what can make us feel excited and interested and inspired. And that's what really good teachers do, right? They make kids appreciate why it is that they're physicists, or whatever it is that they do. And even if the kid doesn't grow up loving physics, at least the kid can appreciate what's so cool about it. And that's the thing that matters. That's what you need out of your education, being able to appreciate all these things, knowing they're out there. So you can choose the one that's good for you. It's just a little bit of what this actually looks like in a kid's life, right? This is actually my daughter, right? My daughter who drew this little drawing of herself in her pink dress there. She's, I think, 6 or something, and she's got a little music stand. You see a little cultural heritage in my household there. Okay, so she's singing this song about her brother, Teddy, Theodore. And I won't sing to you, I'll just read it, okay? So it says, "Oh, Teddy," she's in kindergarten, "Oh, Teddy, we love you more than the whole earth size. As the earth spins every day, we love you as much as usual. But sometimes, even more, as you make us proud and happy that you're you." So, you know, like, the basic question I always ask here is this a song or a poem about this little girl's love for her baby brother? Or is this a song about her budding knowledge of planetary science? Right? We understand and we feel our relationships. That's what we're primarily ready to do biologically, and we have to co-opt that and use it in the service of academic learning. Oh, and here's Teddy when he came along. Okay, a couple of years later, he's about younger here, 5, just going into kindergarten, beginning of kindergarten. And this was his first letter to us, right? It's a little card, and I took pictures of the envelope. And on the outside of the envelope, on the front, it says, "Mom, Dad, Teddy." And it's got little faces, all of the little letters, little people, little hearts floating around, and trees, you know, it's really cute. I actually think the little letters in the letter, the little faces in the letters are pretty cool. He did that for a very short time, and it actually shows us a lot about how people learn to read. Because learning to read, it turns out, is very unnatural for the brain. Brains are not naturally inclined toward it at all. That's why it takes so much effort to learn it, and so many people really don't do it very well. Because if you think about it, out in the world, your brain's much smarter than to think that when you've seen the mirror reverse of something, it's actually a whole different thing. It says, no, 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 no. It's the same thing, I'm looking at it from the other side, right? If I see that podium from here, and I see that podium from the other side, I know it's still the same podium. But if I see a thing that looks like this, and I see a thing that looks like that, they're not the same thing. One's a W, one's a M. And you gotta learn that, or a C and a U, and all that, or a B and a D, right? That makes it hard for the brain. Turns out there's only one part of the brain, only one system in the cortex, that actually evolutionarily has a precedent for processing things that are, where the laterality matters. And it's looking at people's facial expressions. Because faces aren't even. We smile a little harder with one side of our face than the other side of our face and stuff like that. And you don't even know it consciously, but if you saw a face that was backwards, like photographers who play games with turning those around, the person looks weird. You're like, I don't trust that guy, right? What's wrong with his smile? Like, I don't believe him, you know? Okay? Our brain does that. And so we have to actually co-opt and steal away brain space that's supposed to be for looking at faces in order to learn how to read. Makes you think maybe it's not a great idea to do it too young, right? At least for me. Some kids are ready at different ages, but I mean, by 6, by 7, yeah, you really need to be doing it. But by 3 and 4, I'm not so sure. Okay. Sorry, you have a question?
What about the dyslexic brain?
Yeah, dyslexia is actually something that is not really wrong with your brain, it's wrong with your culture. And you just have a bad fit between your brain and your culture. And if you had been born in China, you'd probably be fine, because they don't have this whole phonological decoding thing. And nobody would have ever known you were a weirdo, right? Sorry, but it's true. Okay, well, so sorry, there you go. So, yeah, there you go.
I had an emotional, loving teacher.
Right, who actually said, took the time to show you, that's right. And lots of kids who are severely dyslexic learn at about age 13. Because why? That's the age when they can use other strategies. They're actually developed enough cognitively, they can say, well, this decoding thing's never gonna work for me. Let me see if I can find another way to just look at that and memorize it a different way and figure out the pattern and learn it, you know what I mean? Yeah, so in dyslexia, kids don't do this very well. And it's not anything, like I said, it's not anything wrong with your brain. It's just a mismatch between the kind of brain processing you have, which is a perfectly good piece of normal, but it just doesn't match well with what we're expecting of your brain. And actually, that's a way to think about all learning disabilities. It's a mismatch between the kid's brain and what we're asking of them in this culture. And so we need to think it's not just the kid's fault, it's also the culture's fault, and we need to find ways to adjust. That doesn't mean making excuses that you're not as smart. It's exactly the opposite of that. You're absolutely as smart, but we gotta find a way to engage the kind of brain you've got, because this isn't gonna, that's the bottleneck for you, right? The worst possible thing you can do is to teach kids with dyslexia by only letting them read age-appropriate, or reading level appropriate materials. Boy, how demoralizing is it to a 14-year-old who's got to read first grade books? It's fine to read them in reading class with a special tutor who's helping you out, but then you need to find another way to get on the History Channel or something and get all the 15-year-old history, because otherwise, you're getting left behind doubly. Not only can't read, you can't get any of the knowledge that all your friends are getting via reading. Okay. But that really does speak to a bigger question, which is you have to understand for your kid, what's the goal? What are we trying to do here? We trying to learn to read? That's a piece of it. We trying to learn about history? Well, that's another piece of it. For a lot of kids, those two things can go together. So some kids, they can't. So you got to be really careful that the learning to read part doesn't eclipsing the learning to history part. If the learning to read can't be the bottleneck that's stopping you from accessing the information, you got to find other ways and argue for your kids to have other options. That doesn't mean stop learning to read. It means learning to read is just one piece of what you're learning how to do. You know, hey, let's face it. If ballroom dancing was how you got from 5th to 6th grade, I'd be a flunky forever. Right? It's just by chance. What does my culture expect of me? Ballroom dancing doesn't really count for much. Good. Yeah. Okay, yeah.
What would be the developmental challenges for hyperlexia?
Yes, great question. Developmental challenges for somebody who's hyperlexic. Any of these things where you've got these really skewed profiles are a difficult thing, because you're trying to fit your kid into an environment that isn't really suited to what they need, right? So here's the thing about hyperlexia. Some kids learn to decode, not to read, but to decode very, very facilely, very quickly. Some kids who usually have autism actually do it extremely fastly. Like I had one friend of mine whose little 1-year-old baby looked at the sale sign as she was going out of they were shopping together and she was looking at their cash register. 1-year-old, she looked at it, she goes, S-A-L-E. And luckily she was smart enough to know, like, whoa, and took her straight to the Yale Autism Clinic and started getting that, and sure enough, that kid just developed autism, right? And they've caught it early enough that they were able to do a lot, right? That's not normal. Why is it not good to be so advanced in one domain like that? There's always a trade-off, okay? Because your brain, that kid's brain is saying, oh, I know how to do this. I know how to do this reading thing. Just decode and make the sound and spit it out my mouth. I'm great at that. Like, let me just do that. And then they don't learn how to actually understand it. And it's really tragic because sometimes these kids will start out and people think they're extremely smart at reading, and then you get to 3rd and 4th grade and you find out, wait, how come they're not understanding anything? Because they're actually not reading to understand, they're reading to decode, which is only a tiny piece of reading. So what you would want to do, I think if you have a hyperlexic kid, is really try to expose them to opportunities in practice to think about what they're reading about and what it means, and give them stuff that's really interesting to read. Discourage them from reading things that they can't possibly really be understanding thoroughly, like the New York Times at age 3. You're not getting a lot out of that. Let's get some books. They might even be hard books, but let's get some books that are actually encyclopedias or something where there's something interesting that you could be learning, right? And really engage the kid to teach them that that's not all there is to learning, and that hyper-focusing on a really narrow aspect of the skill is going to make you look great right now. I don't mean look great to the kid, but to the testing, it's going to make you look great right now, but it makes it really difficult for you later. So what you want to do is really engage that kid in a lot of opportunities to think about the broader meaning making. And maybe when they're reading, they just get so into decoding that they're just loving it, and you can't do it. So then maybe that kid watches History Channel movies with you or something, or documentaries where you're talking about, so what's going on in this thing, right? Which is a topic they're interested in, or science, documentary with Bill or something else, so that the kid's actually being forced to interact with the meaning-making process, when what's easiest and most comfortable is to just decode and spit it out their mouth, but that's hiding the fact that they're not actually understanding. Does that make sense? Yeah. Because you want to really help your kid balance themselves. So if there's a kid who's super inclined toward a skill that's going to bottom out at a certain time, like, and phonological decoding is one of those. There's only so good at it you can get before you're kind of done learning that. And now you're learning, you're reading to learn. That if they get too far ahead of that, they're going to make it difficult for themselves to shift tracks later into leading to learn. So, go back to Teddy. So there he is, showing us his little brain trying to, he used to tell me at that age too. He used to say, Mommy, I can't read, I can't do this, like in kindergarten, because the letters are just staring at me. They won't stay still, they keep jumping. And I was like, jumping? Really? No, it lasted a couple of weeks, but you know, his letters were jumping. It kept, I think what he was trying to say is, it's an M, it's a mountain. It's an M, it's a mountain, right? And he's just like, well, what are you? I'm trying to read you. Hold still. You know what I mean? That's his little brain. Now he reads just fine. But in kindergarten, it was tougher for him. Here we are, 5 years old. Dear Mom and Dad, period. I love you, Theodore. Right, the whole Theodore is actually kind of cute, because we never call him Theodore. We call him Ted, or Teddy, right? Or lots of other cute little names I have for him. But we don't call him Theodore, right? He came up to me one day when he was 5 and said, Mom, I just call him Theodore. I said, well, here's how you spell Theodore, but I'm just curious, so, what do you need to know for it? And he said, I'm writing you a letter. I said, oh, see, the cultural knowledge. Writing a letter. One uses one's formal mode of address. You know, this is serious. Okay? Like, he's bringing all that to it. All right. And here's the back of the envelope, which I just love. Here it is. He's got this picture going on, and it's Ted. You know, what is that? What's that picture? So, Mom, that's instructions for how to open an envelope. Really? He's like, yeah, let me tell you about it. So it's 2 colors, right? Color-coded. My little engineer kid, right? Who had trouble in kindergarten? Teddy or Nora? Just keep thinking, okay. My little engineer, here he is. Blue is like the instructions of what to do, and black is like the order you do it in. Oh, okay. So blue is where you look. See this arrow pointing right down to the point? So when you want to open an envelope, the part you should pay attention to is this little point right here. Like, don't be looking around everywhere else. This is where you look. And I put a box around it for you, okay? Okay. And then what you do, once you look there, is you stick your finger under the side, and you lift it up and up and up. And that's how you open an envelope. Right? I mean, what is that in kindergarten? That's like diagramming, consecutive thinking, it's three-dimensional, it's like, right? But then we got this going on. Dear, whoops, sorry about that. Mixed capitals and lower cases, okay? All I'm saying is it's not that Teddy doesn't need to learn to write with correct capitalization, and he does now, but that we need to recognize in our kids the seeds of the things they're good at and they're interested in, and use those, right? Follow up on those. I bet you anything, I don't know yet, he's only 10, but he says he wants to be an inventor and an engineer, right? He's got it right there. That's basically it, you know? Oh, and this is just a picture of my student, Jeremy Brockington here, a PhD student who did his PhD thesis with physicists. And so I just want you to know that this isn't just about relationships in the sense of like mushy-feely things that we think are so emotional and cute, right? I'm actually talking about real learning, okay? So what he did was he actually looked at GSR and heart rate responding in expert physicists and expert engineers at the postdoctoral level. These are people who've already done PhDs and more training. They love physics or mechanical engineering, whatever it is they're going to do with their life. And he had them look at simple little diagrams of things like falling out of airplanes and stuff that were either sort of, you know, common misconceptions or the real scientific way that a thing falls out of an airplane and all that. And of course, everybody in the experiment knew the right answers and they hit it. But only the physicists, not the engineers, showed little microscopic amounts of sweating on the bottoms of their feet in the milliseconds after the proper diagram went. Right? It's like, that's my world. I love that. Right? That's the same mechanism you see when you see somebody you love or when you feel attached to somebody. And we've co-opted it in the service of loving physics. What does it tell you about the nature of expertise? Samir Zeki is a neuroscientist in England who took expert mathematicians. Did I tell you about this? No, I've been talking all day. I can't remember who I told about it. Okay, so he took expert mathematicians and he had them look at equations, some of which they labeled as beautiful equations, and apparently mathematicians know exactly what you mean by that. Like E equals MC squared is apparently very beautiful, right? It's simple, it's clean, but it explains powerfully huge things in the universe. And then there's other equations that are true, but they're just, you know, they're kind of clunky and ugly, and they don't really do much for me, as a mathematician says that. He put them in the scanner, and he had them react and watch those equations and think about it and say how they were feeling. And what happens? Almost exactly the same thing, the same neural mechanisms I get in my virtue experiment. It's like, that's a beautiful equation, right? I mean, what is disciplinary knowledge? It's the ability to feel emotions. How do you feel those emotions? By knowing a whole heck of a lot about the domain and having worked so much in it that you can actually appreciate it, right? So I'm going to just close with a little piece of a poem from Stanley Kunitz, who was the poet laureate of the United States twice during his lifetime. The first time wasn't really called that yet. And I love the way that poets and artists oftentimes really show us, they can't give us the data, right? But they show us what I like to call the world's itchy problems, the things that we kind of need to deal with in our society, that we know are common, but we don't know what to think yet. Okay? And Mr. Kunitz wrote this poem when he was 98 years old. And he died when he was 103. And he wrote this poem called The Layers, which is about looking back over his life and sort of deciding what it means to him now as a 98-year-old to have lived this life, right? And I'm just going to do the first couple of words, but to me they speak really powerfully and presciently to the discovery of those medulla activations and stuff in our data. He says, I have walked through many lives, some of them my own, and I'm not who I was, though some principle of being abides, from which I struggle not to stray. And I interpret that my frame as meaning, as the geeky biologist is meaning, living life is not a kind of removed, disembodied sort of thing where you're separate from the actual actions of it. No, you're in your life living it, you're doing it, you're feeling it on the bottoms of your feet. And you can do that not just in one life, but in many kinds of lives. For a little while, you lived in that lady in the blue dresses life. And that's how you were able to appreciate what it must feel like to be her. And education, in essence, enables you to have many kinds of lives. I can have a life as a scientist, and a life as a mother, and a life as a wife, and a life, right? In so many different ways, because I can move myself around those contexts and enjoy them all. And doing that changes me. I'm not who I was. And yet, right, it funnels down to these stories that we tell ourselves, that we build for ourselves, that become our values, that become the core of who we are. And they activate all the way down into the bottom of your brainstem, into the medulla that you can't even live without. That's the essence of who we are. And we hold on to that not just by keeping our bodies physically well, but by keeping our spirits and our minds and our intellect socially and culturally well. Thanks.
Thanks very much for that. So,
You're welcome.
check some of the deeper scientific thoughts, which I so appreciate. With sort of the legacy educational culture we have that's established, but it's starting to be disrupted. As recently I read about Harvard admissions areas considering dropping the SAT requirement. And they didn't just say, we want to see how many community service hours you can do to gain that. They said, look, we want to see what you're doing with your family. And you mentioned it. We want to see how you're constructing your community. What you're doing that is actually action-oriented, not just checking boxes and community service hours and SATs.
Right.
Because I think we're getting the feedback from subsequent generations that have gone off and come back and say, we don't want any more perfect SAT kids that remember getting involved with test music. So help me understand how your science can be applied to this sort of Scythian breakdown, that legacy system of remember, store,
Yeah.
yourself. And Rosarian is actually kind of getting it. Thank you, this current administration. But how do you connect sort of like where we're going on this? Because it's very frustrating to see the old legacy system not.
Yeah, and it's unsettling, right? I've got kids I need to get into college too, that's the reality, right? What I see, and I know people working on that stuff, right? I came from Harvard. So what I see is that their understanding that what really counts, what really predicts success, and what really makes interesting, innovative thinkers who are capable of really digging in to learning at a place like Harvard in the ways that they would like people to, right, are not necessarily the kids who can just churn out the perfect scores on everything. Those kids do well too, that's good, that's not easy to do, I'm not saying it is. But what they want is really to honor the whole kid and understand, like, not just what can you do, but who are you? And it's really very well aligned with what I'm saying here, which is that, you have to be able to do stuff to be able to accomplish things. Like, you can't just not know your math and then suddenly build bridges when you get to be like, that won't happen, right? Okay, you gotta know your math. But you gotta know your math in a way that lets you understand what it's for. And that means maybe thinking about it and working in a way that it actually connects to who you are more meaningfully, so you can decide how to be creative and how to use it. And I think what they want to see evidence of is that kids are capable of thinking that way. That the kids aren't just trying to please other people with the external metrics, but they're actually trying to build themselves as people. And that they think an experience at Harvard will facilitate that for them and they'd be able to contribute significantly. And I think that's as much as we know. I mean, I also heard that they're also limiting the number of things you can tell them to 3. We don't want to know every single thing you did. We're like, just tell me a couple things that really matter to you. And why? Because they don't need a big long list of all the stuff you did. And like, I literally got to see. I mean, it's so cute, but I get CDs from kids trying to come into my lab. So like, it's a kid's resume that says I walked the neighbor's dog while she was on vacation. I'm like, God, I did that when I was 15 too, but I didn't put it on my resume. You know what I mean? Like, oh my gosh, it was called being a nice neighbor, and you just go go, you know what I mean? Anyway, so I think we're getting in the habit of trying to do things so that they show a certain face to other people, instead of trying to do things so that they really genuinely build who you are on the inside. And like, for example, I published, and you can go find it, it's gotta be still, I published a blog post or an editorial in Ed Weekly. I don't know exactly when it came out, maybe last September, something like that, which was a response to my daughter's school district, her junior high, which is a public junior high, but very, very high performing one, okay, California, which had a tutoring company that put an ad in their thing that came from the principal, which, so to me, that's an implicit endorsement, and that's what made me respond. I mean, a tutoring company, because they want the newspaper. When it comes through my principal to all parents in the school, somebody just says something. And it basically said, you know, hire XX tutoring company, because do you want your ninth grader, this went to the 6th to 8th graders, okay, 6th graders, do you want your ninth grader to hit the ground running on the very first day of ninth grade, impressing colleges with what they can do? We'll help you. You can read it. I put the post, like, I took off the names and I stuck it right in the blog post. It's like, we'll help you tailor an academic program to your child's strengths. That's basically saying, we'll help you make sure your child never tries anything they're not sure if they're good at. Because if they do, they might fail, and somebody might think they're stupid, and then it's all over, right? Then it says, we'll help your child develop their own personal brand. That's their wording, their own personal brand. And I'm thinking, my child's not for sale. You know what I mean? What you're basically telling your little adolescent kid who's just looking to you to say, hey, what kind of adult do I might want to be with someday, right? I'm 13, I'm 12, I can start thinking about that, right? And what you're basically saying to the kid is, you know, we're the big grown-ups in this situation, and we've been out in the world, and you haven't seen it, and we haven't. We looked around, and we know you too, and you know what? You're not going to cut it. So we're going to help you fake it. Develop a brand, develop some kind of appearance that will trick people into thinking you're better than you are, and then, you know, that's the only way you can really make this work. So here we go. And that's what you're telling your 7th grader in that message. And I, like, sent that in the blog post. Yeah. Anyway, that's what I think they're trying to get against. They're trying to go against school districts and tutoring companies that are saying, like, tailor to your kid's strengths from the first day of 9th grade. So they don't try anything they're not great at and find out the hard way that they aren't acing everything, right? I mean, that's exactly what Harvard doesn't want. A kid that can't take risks intellectually, a kid that can't try things out. And other colleges too. Harvard's just the one that you happen to, you know, mention, because they sort of lead the way. When they say we're not taking SATs, a whole bunch of other colleges can say, oh, phew, we're not either, right? Okay? Yeah. Which there are already a lot that said it first, to their credit. Okay. Because now the onus is on the kids to actually demonstrate what they can do. Oh, good. They're not smaller. They're 3-year-old crops. They're cool.
But this whole notion of education kind of branding yourself, not just with, like, you know, IEPs and extracurriculars, but I think kids are becoming so savvy these days and so aware, specifically because of, you know, social media platforms.
Yes.
That they create personas.
Absolutely. That's been documented. You noticed it, but it's actually been shown by research. That's right.
I mean, in ways that I don't think existed even 20, 10, 15 years ago.
Right.
And how does that affect?
So how do these personas that kids are expected to create for themselves online now affect who they are? There's actually really nice research coming out that it makes you feel insecure and worthless. That's how teenagers feel like, you know, because when you can curate your Facebook profile so only the prettiest photos are there, right? Then you feel like I must be a total ugly loser if when I roll out of bed on Saturday morning at 10 a.m., I don't look like that, right? And so people actually are implicitly comparing themselves and feeling like they got to keep up and they got to show this appearance, they got to build this profile of themselves that starts to be them. It's their avatar or whatever, and it's their profile, it's who they are. And I don't want my kids' selves at that age being constrained to some, two-dimensional profile that they can construct in the cyberspace for other people to see. What if you want to change who you are? Why don't you try a little bit of a different identity for a bit? What if you think, maybe I'm actually going to be a little bit more liberal, a little bit more conservative, or I'm going to think, you know what I mean? I'm going to try that out when I'm 13 and 14, and that's the safe time to try it. You got your parents there, you got your people around you, you got lots of supports. See who you are, kid. Let's try it on. You can't do that when you're trying to show it to the world all the time. And like my daughter's 14, just turned 14 on Saturday. I gotta get used to it. Okay, she's 14, right? She's got tons of friends. Like this isn't like code speak for a kid who's like having a hard time socially or is just geeky and doesn't really have any friends. She's got good little friends, nice kids, great kids. She has a great time. None of them do it. None of them have Facebook profiles. They just don't do it. They have cell phones. They text each other. They do their homework over whatever, where they can see each other, right? And I've actually listened in and I can see what they're doing. She and her little girlfriends are on there doing their homework. And they're saying, well, I got this for geometry. What'd you get? And they're saying, well, no, I didn't know. Well, let me explain. I thought it was like this. And they're actually working together. And then they gossip a little, and then they work together. They really do, right? And that's all great. They're 14-year-old girls gossip. I mean, that's get your work done too, but it's fun. But they don't do the whole, and some of the kids do. They do Instagram or whatever it's called. And Nora told me, my daughter told me, she took me aside one day and she said, this was about 2 years ago though. Now I think she just would say what she thought. But she came in 6th grade and she said to me, Mom, I hope you don't mind. I told all my new 6th grade friends, because she went to the middle school and started, I told my new friends that you won't let me use Instagram. And I was like, okay, great. And she's like, I was like, well, tell me what I allow you to do next week, okay? She's like, okay. Well, we're joking, but it was kind of true, because she's like, I don't want to be on there. I see how much my friends get hurt. When they see parties they're not invited to and whatever. And she said, I saw a party I wasn't invited to, that this girl posted a picture of. And then I thought to myself, I don't even like that girl. If she had invited me, I would have thought, God, I got to give up my whole weekend to go to her party so I can be polite. I don't feel like going to that. I want to hang out with, right? And then she thought to herself and thought, I don't want to be part of that. I don't want to be part of that yet. I can't deal with it. I told my friends that you don't allow me. I was like, right. It works for you as an excuse. I'm happy to be the scapegoat. It's totally good. I'm a grown up. It's all right. And sometimes, and I told her too, and this is for my kid. You do what works for your kid, right? Different kids are different cultures are different in different places. I tell you, if you want to do that, if you want to have a profile and all your friends are, and you're the only one who isn't or something, that's fine with me. Why don't we go on together and we'll do it, and we'll talk about it, and we'll figure out what works and what isn't, and we'll turn it off when it's time and put it away, and let's go do something else and have the rest of our life, But she actually decided she doesn't really want one. Yeah. So, I think we have much more power as parents than we take. And I don't mean power like to control your kid. I don't control my kid, right? But I think power to actually set an example for our kids about, and give them the permission to not do it if they don't feel comfortable with it. And I think a lot of kids would love the easy out to say, my dad doesn't let me. And then they go and they say, what? My friend Susie's dad doesn't let her either. Hey, what do you know, right? All of a sudden it starts coming up. And there you go. I think that we actually just need to keep our kids in a place where they learn to manage it. They don't have to be outcasts or not see the movies everybody's watching and stuff, but also where we put limits and say cell phones are off at night. That's it. And, so the kid just talked us into getting her an iPhone for her birthday for 14. She really wanted an iPhone. She finally looked at me and she said, Mom, you can only live in this high, fast-paced, teenager world for so long before you start to actually want some of it like everybody else. And I was like, yeah, I guess you're right. She's like, but don't worry, I'm going to use it to text my grandma. And I was like, okay. And send her pictures of me and my friends having a good time. I was like, all right. If you're sending them to my grandma, or, my mom, that's fine with me, I guess, right? So, she wants some of it. I'm not saying she doesn't want some of it, but she's learning how to, turn it off and manage it. And I think that's what you need. Because in this world, the reality is that's going to be all out there. They don't need to just be completely shielded. They need to learn to regulate and to manage and have the confidence to say, this doesn't work for me, I'm not doing that. If people need to leave, don't feel, I know you've got babysitters and everything, don't feel rude if you just want to sneak out. Yes?
I want to bring it back to screen time and video games on. There you mentioned having reflection
Yeah.
Is it more relevant to the content of what they're looking at or how
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I think it's some of both. Yeah, I think it's probably some of both. So violent, first-person shooter video games, not good for you, ever. Not even in a small amount of time, right? Not good for you. And that's been shown, right? But, even the most educational video games, like just the medium of it is teaching your eyes and straining your brain in ways that, maybe you don't do too much of either. Plus, there's always not just what is this doing to you, but what else could you be doing with that time? Like running around or playing outside, or, to be getting some exercise, or, talking with your parents, or helping clean the house. I mean, like stuff that's real that you gotta do, you know what I mean? So, I think you have to really just think about establishing a balance that works for you and your kid, and understanding that these things change all the time as the kid's growing and developing. The world's changing, and your what you thought worked might have to change. And maybe you start to change, you think, listen up, and then you start to see changes in your kid you don't like. And you say, you know what? You sit and talk with them and say, like, I gotta say, as your mom, I'm a little worried. You used to be like this, and we see you moving, and now you're really getting caught up, so you're always playing that game whenever we're not, whenever you're not required to be doing something else. I think that's good for you. What do you think? Let's start turning it off again.
The flip side of that, though, some of these games are actually educational.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, some of it is good, but you can't learn from ABC Mouse what you can learn from hanging out with your grandma and just talking and playing, right? Like, for example, it's actually been empirically shown, like what's the big red dog? Clifford the Big Red Dog, right? Clifford the Big Red Dog books. You can read them in paper, or you can read them on an iPad, right? And then it barks when you push the Clifford and all that stuff, right? And kids love it. They get all engaged in it. And then they actually test how much the kids actually remember and learn from it. The kids with the paper books learn more vocabulary and remember more. Why? Because when you actually take the kids using it, the kid with the paper book has to go get a grown-up to help them. They go sit down and then they start reading and then they're talking. The Clifford doesn't jump off the page by himself and start barking. The kid's got to make up that part. And then they can pretend that he did it, and then they can imagine, and they can draw it, and they can talk about it, and then they can be Clifford, and you know what I'm saying? Whereas when it's all there for you, you just sit back and relax and watch the show. That kind of passiveness doesn't teach you things, right? So I think a little of it's fine. If you're in the doctor's office and you really got to keep the kid from touching all the goopy, germy toys, right? Bring your Clifford the Big Red Dog book, on the iPad. It'll be all right, But then put it away and play with regular books. You know what I'm saying? Like, I think we just need to be reasonable about it. But also to think that there's some kind of magic learning that's happening in digital environments that can't happen other ways is just naive. It's not true. And also, for little kids, babies and stuff, like the Einstein videos and all that stuff has actually been proved to be bad for your kid. Don't use that stuff. It's bad for babies' brains because they're teaching their brain attention patterns that don't actually exist in the world, and it's associated with problems developing ADD and other stuff. There was a big group of scientists who wrote a full scientific report on the studies on what that stuff does to babies and showed that it's actually false advertising to say that it makes your baby smarter. Or imply that. Yeah, you don't need that stuff. You don't need it at all.
So based on your research that emotion is an essential part of learning, what are your thoughts on the development of artificial intelligence and thinking machines based on all the research you've done?
Yeah, I've got all these colleagues who worked on that stuff. And I'm not an expert in artificial intelligence. I mean, that said, like, I hang around with a lot of people who do it, so I know something about what they do, and they've got a lot of, I think the big question is going to be not what can it do, but why would it do it? Because that's what human beings have that machines don't. We have that intrinsic desire to stay alive and to care. And the only way machines get that is if you artificially build it in, or you've got a programmer that's putting it in for it, right? And so that makes a qualitatively different kind of processing, I think. And so, but clearly machines can accomplish incredible kinds of things more efficiently and faster than we can.
But are they taking the approach of baking emotion in as the key?
Yeah, people are trying to do that. People are trying to do that. But still, it's like a code that says, you like this, you don't like this by definition. Humans don't really have that. Humans are a little bit flexible, right? And, and so, that's just what I think. But that's just my opinion, and we'll see, I could be proved totally wrong, and that would be cool too. There's somebody way in the back.
It was back to the video games, not that I went too far away, but I had read a paper once on television shows, Mr. Rogers,
Yes.
and then Brain and how the children react and how it was very peaceful, and then SpongeBob SquarePants, and all of
Yes.
a sudden the prefrontal cortex stops working
Yeah.
and the fight or flight response comes out, and your child, the entire time that they're watching this, has this fight or flight reaction, and the cortisol is going through their body.
Yes.
And the same thing with video games, and even at a higher level. And just how bad it is for that child that
Yeah.
entire time. So is there truth to that?
Yeah, there actually is some. So here's the thing, it's not your kid's gonna like become a terrible person if they watch SpongeBob SquarePants, okay, right? Drive me bananas, but anyway. But the thing is, it's true that what you're doing is you're engaging that network that allows them to look into the here and now, right? And just be, and what they're actually doing, if you watch a kid watching that, they're going, right? That's what they're doing. Mr. Rogers drives adults nuts because he's great for kids. He's encouraging them to reflect. If you ever watch Mr. Rogers, right? He comes out and he says, oh, here, we're going to the park today, and here are some swings. Have you ever tried out a swing? And then he waits. And the kid goes, And then he says, okay. And here we go along with Mr. whatever his name is, with the mailman, right? So he actually stops and asks the kid rhetorical questions, and the kids answer. When you actually watch 3-year-olds watching it on film, they're answering him, and they're engaging. It's still TV, but he had a much, much smarter kind of dialogue where he was expecting kids to reflect and think before he moved on to the next thing, right? And he'd say like, so-and-so said, have you ever felt sad? But then he doesn't just go rushing on to the next thing the way that like, some shows do. He stops and lets the kid wonder about it for a few seconds, right? And that's kind of the difference.
It was
I
just
love
interesting
this
that it's the withdrawal, that they were saying the withdrawal that some children experience after, or you take it away.
Yes, because you
That
need it. It's
so-
like feeding that part of your brain that allows you to look out here at the expense of the one that allows you to go in and think, I wonder, have I ever ridden a swing? Or felt sad? Or had a friend that, needed a wheelchair? What do you think? You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Okay, yes. Okay, so boys and girls. So here's the thing. There's a lot of research showing the differences in male and female brains. Okay, and that's clear because there's differences in male and female bodies. And your brain is shaped by the hormones that your body's producing, definitely. Okay, in these very complex patterns. So there's certain kinds of patterns of behavior that are sex-specific, but how those become incorporated into gender-specific behaviors, in other words, behaviors that are part of your identity and part of your repertoire that's socially appropriate, that's learned. That's learned. So the thing is, the things that are sex-specific are very low level. They have to do with like reproductive functions and things like that, okay, mainly, and certain kinds of mental capacities. But even there's a huge amount of variance, and there's also there's like a big overlap, like sex is a binary variable, but actually hormones are not binary. So things like testosterone, there's a distribution of how much testosterone different men have and of how much different women have, and both sexes need to have it or you've got health problems, okay? And there's a big overlap in the middle. What they actually show, for example, on spatial ability, there's certain kinds of spatial ability that men typically score higher than women typically score. Though if you teach the women how to do it, they can do it just as well, right? But what they actually show is that that's actually related to testosterone levels in the brain during puberty, not to gender directly, not to sex directly. But it just so happens that testosterone is confounded with gender because it tends to be higher in boys than in girls, and it's so, but it isn't always. And so that's why you can get this effect that looks like boys are better at it. So really, yes, the brains are different. There was a very nice Scientific American article a year or so ago that really summed up all the science around this, if you're interested in it. Yes, the brains are somewhat different. And what that means for behavior and for feelings and emotions is anything but clear. It's not, there's not a binary thing. Because how you build your brain into a person is all about your experiences.
Can I just interrupt one quick second? I think you have time for one more question.
Perfect. One more question. Wait, please have 3 more questions. 3 more questions. 1, 2, 3. Okay, go ahead.
What are your thoughts on like the AR reading assessments and everything? As far as forth and seeing what they comprehended and showing their reflection on the story.
Yeah.
I don't know, I find them sort of always, I don't really, it bothers me when my kids are tested that way as opposed to submitting a book report.
Something that they created out of their own mind and hold together a story.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Right, yeah. So it depends what you're going for, what the goal is. So if you want to test whether the kid can take a multiple choice test that's testing basic factual stuff that's presented a certain way and make a choice, a forced choice, then that's what that's testing. If you want to test whether the kid can actually use what they read to build their own story, argument back about what it meant, that's something different. So what you really want is to know, what are you trying to understand? Did the kid just basically comprehend the factual stuff that happened? Did Jane go to the store in this story? Yes or no, right? But if you want to actually know anything deeper than that, then you need to have different kinds of assessments. So I think we need to really tailor our assessments depending on what we want to know in the moment about the kid.
Well, we have these sort of where like Harvard and everyone else will lead in, like there's just a multiple choice sort of questions and answers, and everyone seems to be prepping so much for that. When in reality, you're not.
Yeah, life never gives you a multiple choice test, right? Yeah.
We need to apply our knowledge more.
Right. So I think we really need a lot of opportunities in education to be able to apply our knowledge and use it to do stuff. Yeah, we need a lot of opportunities for that. Does that mean that all of the other kind of testing needs to go away? I don't see a lot of value in the other kind of testing, but maybe somebody needs it for something. You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't think it's inherently bad, except for so far as it's taking up time that the kid could have been doing something more useful, maybe. So I understand where you're coming from, right? And I think we need to really think about what the kid was doing as they answered those questions, and is that the mental process that we wanted to actually have them engage in, and was that the optimal use of their time, and did we learn as much as we could have about how they're thinking and how to help them think better next time? And if you can answer that question with multiple choice tests, then you can, and if you can't, then you can't. You know what I'm saying?
As a neuroscience scientist, I was just wondering if you had done any research on just the fact that we're living in such a technological advanced society right now, and developing paths and everything. What is your opinion on all the exposure to electromagnetic radiation?
All the exposure to what?
That's Wi-Fi and stuff like that.
Oh, you mean like the health concerns of Wi-Fi shining at you, or you mean using it? Oh, yeah. Yeah, you know what, I mean, I don't know. But here's the thing. I think it's better to be, it's always safer to be more conservative. You can't go wrong that way, right? And so here's something I do know, but I only know this because my husband is an aerospace engineer, okay? And that is that the guidelines for what's RF safety were decided, apparently, according to him, so I didn't verify this, okay, but the guy's smart. Anyway, were decided back in experiments that they did, and I don't know when exactly, the 50s or the 60s or something, right? When they actually looked at cells that they were irradiating with RF frequencies, and when a guy looking under a microscope, and it probably was a guy, right? Looking under a microscope could see visible damage in the cell as the thing started to get from being fried, that's too much RF energy, okay? Right, so the safety limits and what's actually safe are probably not the same thing. That said, we don't know enough about what's actually safe. So, like, for example, you can take simple steps. I do in my house, right? Turn off the Wi-Fi at night. Nobody's using it when you're sleeping. You don't even need all night by it. It saves energy anyway, right? Or plug in your wired connection to your computer when you're at your desk all day. If you're walking around and you need your Wi-Fi, turn it on for a little while, but you don't need to have it on all the time when you're not using it just because. And you know, yeah, I don't think we know, but I think someday we're going to find out, and hopefully we'll have decided the right way. You know? And they usually lots of money. Is she allowed? Okay. All right. Okay.
So we've been learning a lot about value, learning, and my question was, how do these parents help them do that? How often do they need to do that? How close in proximity to what they learn do they have to do that? Do they do that alone, or do they do that with us?
Yeah.
And then the second question is, talk about caring about what they're learning as a way to make sure right? So how do you have, you know, 7th and 8th grade students curious about math or whatever it is that's not really setting them on fire, so that they care about it in a way other than their internal motivation, their brains, so that they can blah, blah, blah.
Right, right. So, okay. Two questions. The first one about the, you want me to repeat the, so I'll summarize the question. So the first one was about how do you do reflection with your kids? I mean, how often, how much, alone, with the parents, like all those kinds of questions. Like, and here's what I'd say there. I mean, I think you have to understand that these things are something that you, as a good parent who cares, knows how to do. And what that means is that you have to really, it takes a lot of effort to be a good parent, and you know that. Like, we all put it in, right? And there's times when it slips and you're busy and you just, you know, you let it go a little bit. And there's times when you're like, okay, I gotta get myself into the chair, go get the kid and say, get off the phone, do the whatever, it's time to have your own, right? You know? So what I'm saying is, there's no prescription. With that said, you know, I think it's really, the more time you can spend, first of all, modeling it for your kids. So one way that I think you teach reflection is to actually show your kids reflecting yourself in real meaningful ways. Right? When I'm upset about something, or when I feel ashamed of something I did that I shouldn't have done it that way, or, you know, something that happened where everybody makes mistakes or thinks, gosh, I wish I hadn't done that, or I didn't do that as well as I could have, or I was mean to her, but I didn't mean to be, and now I realize, oh, she was actually coming over because she was, you know what I mean? Like, I say it. I try to talk it through with my kids and show them what it looks like to actually be a responsible adult who's proud when they earned it, and who's repentant when they screwed up, and who's, you know, who's humble about that. Like, I try, you know what I mean? Like, you know, that's all I can do. So that's one thing, is really modeling it. So there's nothing like the mom who's got the little kids and is saying, well, we're having our free outdoor time at the park and not playing video games, and they're doing this on their cell phone the entire time the kid's playing at the park. You know, you're like, put it away and play with the kid, or chit-chat with the other moms, or do something like here and now. You know, like actually model being here and now, because your kid knows the difference, you know. They can tell if you're talking to something else or talking to somebody else, or if you're actually here, just enjoying the trees or whatever it is you're doing, right? So that's one thing, model it yourself. The other thing is, I think it's going to change dynamically depending on the context. I mean, I know with my kids, and I'm sure it's probably true with all kids, you know, sometimes they really need you to think it through with them. They got to a point where they're not sure what they think, and they're only X age, and you know, there's stuff going on, and they sort of need an adult to just unload it onto who can give them some perspective, and that's your job as their parent, right? And then sometimes they really feel like they're doing it, and they've got it, and you feel confident, and you're connecting with them, and they seem like everybody's going along, and so you go along, you know? So I think you don't expect it to be all the same all the time. Sometimes they really need you, and sometimes they're a little more independent, they're trying it out, and then, you know what I mean? And so I think that, that's all I can tell you, that there's no like prescribed amount, 2 hours a week, just what the doctor orders, right? It's more like, what's your intent? And that's really what's going to show through. There's no kind of hiding it by fulfilling a quota. It actually has to be what you genuinely believe in, because kids see through that. You know, it's kind of like bilingualism. You can't grow a bilingual kid genuinely speaks 2 languages by just deciding you're gonna. Like, it has to be your language that you really love and care about, and then you naturally speak it with your kid, and they naturally want to talk it with you, and then they go to school and naturally speak other stuff, and that doesn't mean it's not a lot of effort for them to learn all those languages. It's hard, right? But if you just decide it's a cool thing to do, and you think you're just gonna fake it with them, they know better than that. You know what I mean? They see right through it, and those kids don't end up actually bilingual in the end. They can understand their grandma, but they really can't talk. That's what they all say by the time they're 18, you know? It's the same thing here. Like, you kind of just gotta really mean it, and actually commit to living it yourself and modeling it for them in a way that works for you, and then take it from there. And not be afraid to actually stand up for what you think is your kid needs when you and your spouse or whoever you're raising your kids with, even if it's, you know, other friends of yours that you, or church members, whoever it is that you go to for like sort of feedback on your thinking, that when you think about that, if you know something in your gut seems like the way to go, that you have the guts to say it to the kid and to make it happen. Because you're responsible for them. You owe it to them, you know? You understand the implications in a way that they don't. That's your job, you know? You're the parent. And so that's all I can really say, is that you have to really live it and believe it. And then after that, just follow your instincts. And there's going to be times when it just can't happen because you're just super busy that week. and you just don't have your quality time. And then you're gonna find that you just come into your kid and say like, turn off the cell phone and the phone in the video game, it's time to reflect. The kid's like, what are you talking about, right? You know what I mean? And then you have to come up with another plan and say, hey, why don't we all go hiking in this really cool canyon and we'll bring a picnic on Saturday and we'll plan to do that. And meanwhile, the cell phones all get left in the car and you've sort of made it something else that you're gonna make a little, you know, a little family outing out of, or a ritual out of, that's fun, that replaces it. You know what I mean? So it doesn't feel like it's fake and it's imposed from the outside in a way that isn't genuine and sort of homegrown. It's kind of like, oh, I read the latest research and so now the whole family is going to proceed like this, right? You know, kids see right through that. You know what I'm saying? Does that help? Yeah, okay. All right.
There is time for one more question.
Oh,
She's had her
okay.
hand back.
I'm so sorry. Okay, go ahead.
You were talking about dyslexic being cultural. Is ADD and ADHD also?
Oh, that's
Sorry.
a good question. Is ADD and ADHD cultural also? Like, almost certainly yes. And keep in mind that that does not mean that it isn't real. Culture is real, right? Okay? So it's real, but it exists in part, and a lot of mental illnesses actually this way, exist in part because of the kind of context that we're exposing our kids to. Okay? So it's the inevitable consequence of the interface between certain kinds of brains, which in different circumstances will grow a little bit differently. They might always have been a little bit hyperactive, a little, you know, excitable and a little distractible, but you know, in some circumstances that wouldn't matter that much. But when you're trying to put them in a seat and they just had a really unhealthy breakfast or whatever, you know what I mean, and made out of sugar and stuff, and then you can't expect them to sit still, then we've really got a problem. So it's always about an interaction, a fit between the individual and their environment. That's what all these issues come out of. And that means a part of it rests with the individual and a part of it rests with the environment. And so we culturally create them. There's actually a very interesting book by a guy named Ethan Waters, who is not an academic, he's a journalist, but he wrote a very interesting book called something like American Like Us, the globalization of the American psyche or something. Just like us, the globalization of the American psyche. And it's about the spread of mental illnesses around the world in different eras. And it just shows how things like how mental illnesses, which are biologically real, right? They're actually changing your brain and changing your behavior, are actually a product of a cultural time. Mental illnesses go in and out of fashion. Stuff like hysteria. We don't have hysteria anymore, right? But it was all the rage in Freud's time, you know what I'm saying? But now you get other stuff. Right? And those things are still real. We get eating disorders and stuff. And that doesn't mean the person's not starving to death. They are. It's totally real. But it's a co-creation of a pattern that's partly the individual and partly the environment and partly the cultural expectations of the environment. And he documents how Japan had a huge epidemic of anorexia. After a particular event, there was almost no dyslexia ever in the history of Japan except for like 1 or 2 cases per year in the whole country that were extremely rare brain disorders where the person couldn't eat, right? And then all of a sudden, there was this pop star in the US who famously developed it or something and did something and it became cool and all these teenage girls all over Japan started getting anorexic. And those kids did have a real problem. It's not like it wasn't real. It needs treatment, right? They're starving themselves because they believe it. But our beliefs are constructed that way. Even biologically based psychiatric disorders that are genetic, like schizophrenia, does not look the same in different cultures. Schizophrenia is associated with different symptoms in Bali than it is in New York City, right? And immigrants who are schizophrenic, right? We actually studied these in my lab. It's immigrants who come from Mexico who have schizophrenia actually change the etiology of their disease when they become American, right? So, for example, in Bali, people with schizophrenia are in pain. There's no doubt about it. They're highly distressed. They're dysfunctional, just like people with schizophrenia anywhere, but they don't experience delusions that are aggressive or suicidal or demeaning. Those are really, or paranoid. They don't get paranoid. Paranoia is the domain of Western cultures when they get schizophrenia. When Westerners get schizophrenia in Europe and in the US, they often develop paranoia, right? But that's cultural. You don't get that in other places. Because your brain is telling stories to itself. it's experiencing all these disequilibriums biologically in it the way it's functioning, and it starts to create some kind of story out of that, and that story gets interpreted in terms of what you know about the world. And if you live in a place like Bali, where it's completely accepted that spirits go in and out of people all the time, then you think what happened is a spirit screwing up your brain or your mind, right? And you're all stuck in that spirit's driving you crazy. But there's no reason to think the spirit's paranoid. Like, why would a spirit happen to be paranoid, right? It's a perfectly happy spirit playing some games on me and making my life miserable. Whereas in New York City, you know, people think the voices are saying things like, kill yourself, you're a loser, right? You know, that doesn't happen in Bali. It's a different cultural context. The brain tells different stories. So what's real is really what we create with our minds. Minds are incredibly powerful things. They're biological things. They shape your brain. Okay?
But one of them MRI showed certain, like, ADD and ADHD different than a person who is not diagnosed with that?
Sure. So there are differences. I think my thing just, oh, there we go. There are biological brain differences that are associated with ADD, but keep in mind that there's also biological brain differences that are associated with feeling inspired and then stopping again, right? So whatever you're using your brain for, we're going to see that on the signature. And if you're using your brain in a atypical way that's different than other people, we're going to see that, and that could be the ADD. It doesn't mean it's real or not real if you look in the brain and you see it. It means that's what your brain's doing. But we all know that already because we're looking at you and we can see what you're acting like, and your brain's producing that behavior. You know what I mean?
Well, join me in thanking you.
Especially if you watch it. Right.